of Vrindavan, you are the daughter of King Rishabhanu, and you are very dear to Lord Krishna. Vanchakalpa tarubhyascha kripa sindhubhyevacha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Offer my respectful obeisances unto all the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. They can fulfill the desires of everyone, just like desire trees, and they are full of compassion for the fallen souls. Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So we'll start by read the verse once more. It was astonishing that Daksha, who was Prajapati, the maintainer of all living entities, was so disrespectful to his own daughter Sati, who was not only chaste but also a great soul, that she gave up her body because of his neglect. So I think we'll start by looking at the context that the verse appears in. So Sati's come to her father's house, finally, even though Lord Shiva advised her not to because of the situation, and he could see that there would be trouble coming. But she went anyhow, and her real purpose, however, in coming to her father's house is deeper than what it appears on the surface. It appears that she's just agitated by the fact that all her relatives are going, and she's wants to go see them and dress up nicely and see them attend the big sacrifice, sort of like almost like a social event type of thing. And she herself is also using that as a pretext. She's going on the plea of that reason. So, but her actual purpose, as revealed in the purports by Srila Prabhupada and the Acharyas, is deeper than that. That she is coming to her father's house to convince her father Daksha to give up his envy of Lord Shiva. That is her actual purpose. And the reason she wants him to give up his envy of Lord Shiva is not just because Lord Shiva is her husband, and out of attachment for her husband she wants her father to give up the envy. It's also deeper than that. I mean, that obviously is there as well, but there's a deeper reason too, in that Lord Shiva is a very great Vaishnava, devotee of the Lord. So, as she explains in the verses, Lord Shiva's position is that he's transcendently situated in the Vasudeva state. The Vasudeva state is the pure state of consciousness beyond the three modes of material nature, wherein Vasudeva, with a long A, or Krishna, is revealed. So it's the state from which pure love of God can arise. As Krishna explains in Bhagavad Gita, Brahmabhuta prasanatma na sochati na kankshati samasarveshu bhuteshu mad bhaktim navate param. That when one is situated on the Brahmabhuta platform, he can enter into pure devotional service unto me. So the Brahmabhuta platform means beyond the three modes of material nature, in the Vasudeva state of consciousness, or the state of pure goodness, beyond the mode of material goodness. So she explains that Lord Shiva is situated on that platform, and he's firmly situated in pure love of God. Therefore, he is not someone who can be criticized. And this is an important point, because it is also important for us to understand this point. that someone who is on the great devotees of the Lord, they are not subject to criticism in the way that an ordinary person is. And the reason is that their consciousness is not under the three modes of material nature. Their consciousness is actually transcendental to the three modes of material nature and is situated under Krishna's internal energy. Therefore, the activities of the pure devotee of the Lord are of a transcendental nature. That is described by Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, Mahatmanam tumam karta daivim ashitim prakritaha. So, Krishna explained it that the great souls, the pure devotees of the Lord, are under the Daivi Prakriti, the divine energy or the internal energy of the Lord. They're not under the three modes of material nature. And therefore they're not subject, therefore it may be hard to understand their activities, because as conditioned souls we are situated under the three modes of material nature. And therefore it will be hard for us to understand the activities of someone who is transcendental to the three modes of material nature and who is directly acting under the Krishna's internal energy for Krishna's pleasure. Everything such a person does is actually in pure Krishna consciousness, for Krishna's pleasure. Nothing is done for their own sense gratification. And this is the position of Lord Shiva. And Sati is making that point. So therefore she's saying to Daksha that he's not subject to criticism in the way an ordinary person is. Now we understand also that Krishna explains that in, as far as I remember, the 11th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, where he says, I don't know the full Sanskrit, but Acharya Mam is two of the words used, where Krishna says that the Acharya is to be considered non-different from me, and is therefore not subject to criticism in the way that an ordinary person is. So, not different from me, Krishna is saying, because all his activities are dovetailed with Krishna. So, the pure devotee's interest is the same as Krishna's interest. His interest is one with Krishna, and therefore is to be considered non-different from Krishna. We sing every morning, Sakshat Haridvaina Samasta Shastre Uktastata Bhavyata Eva Shadvir. That the spiritual master is considered to be non-different from the Supreme Lord. So, because his interest is one with the Supreme Lord. So therefore, when dealing with, or when considering, for example, our spiritual master and Srila Prabhupada, maybe we're less inclined to do it with Srila Prabhupada, but maybe with the very senior, elevated devotees who we have contact with regularly, including our spiritual master, we have to be careful not to consider them subject to criticism in the way we would an ordinary person, or even just to consider them in a mundane way, what they're doing and so on, in a sort of light way, or like that, not in a grave way. So we should always have a mood of very deep and firm respect for the spiritual master and the very elevated devotees. Understanding that their activities are actually not ordinary activities, they're not under the modes of material nature, that they're under a different energy, and they're acting in a different way to what our material senses can appreciate or conceive. Therefore not subject to mundane criticism. So that's an important point we can learn from this pastime, which Daksha evidently has misunderstood with reference to Lord Shiva. And it would be especially possible with Lord Shiva, because Lord Shiva is also like an avaduta. So the pure devotees of the Lord although they're all situated under the internal energy of the Lord, they have different services which they do, and so therefore their activities may appear differently. So, for example, those who are avadutas have complete neglect of the social system, and they act completely out of the bodily concept, out of the bodily concept of life. They don't act at all in reference to ordinary material dealings. So that is their service, to show that actually we have nothing to do with the material body. But then there are other acharyas who act in a different way, who act more in relation to the social structure, because they're doing particular outreach activities, trying to reach the conditioned souls. So, for example, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami, Srila Prabhupada's spiritual master, was more acting with reference to the social system, and because he was trying to establish a worldwide spiritual movement which people could relate to. Therefore, he did not act like an avaduta, although others some previous acharyas did. So in all cases, they are acting under Krishna's direction, for 100% for Krishna's pleasure. And their activities all have a very deep purpose beyond what our material senses and intelligence can appreciate. So Lord Shiva is acting more in the avaduta state, and there's a lot that can be said of Lord Shiva and his activities, why he does certain things, and really in most cases, in so many cases at least, he is misunderstood by many persons today as well. So Lord Shiva has he smears ashes from cremated bodies on his own body, for example, and he wears instead of like most demigods wear a garland, he has a garland but it's made out of skulls, and most of the demigods dressed very opulently and nicely, but Lord Shiva just wears, sometimes he doesn't wear anything, or he may just wear an animal skin or just some old rag or something. So but his purpose is very deep. So in one sense he's relating to the 11 entities in the mode of ignorance, but in his real inner mood is that he's completely neglecting the material opulence. So he's basically mocking material opulence and material enjoyment. Why? Because he has a much greater opulence, and that is also described by Sati at some point earlier in this chapter, that she explains to her father that Lord Shiva has an opulence much greater than yours, because Daksha is a very opulent demigod, was a very high-ranking demigod, you could say. But she explains that Lord Shiva has a much greater opulence, and that is the opulence of pure love of God, pure love of Krishna. And when one has that opulence of pure love of Krishna, one does not care at all for any material opulence whatsoever. One is completely detached from it. So Lord Shiva is relishing always, like often when you may see pictures of him sometimes chanting on beads, so he's always relishing devotional service to the Supreme Lord and chanting the holy name of the Lord, and he's situated in that ecstasy of love of God. And just to mock the material opulence and show what it really is, where it really is at, he does these things. So for example, others may wear a flower garland, but that flower garland will fade and become just stool eventually of some worms or something. So he right from the start just has a garland of skulls, showing that this is actually what material existence looks like. And of course, also those skulls he doesn't just make them ordinary skulls, they are skulls of very elevated devotees of the Lord. And he, in terms of clothing, others wear very opulent clothes, and he shows that actually it's not at all worth or necessary at all. He just wears any old rag, because even those clothes that they are wearing will one day become just old rags. So all this temporary opulence is mocking and showing that the real opulence is the opulence of love of Krishna. And that is what he has. And Sati points that out to Daksha. That is the real opulence that Lord Shiva and I have. Another interesting point is that Lord Shiva gives so many people. There's another point Sati makes, that her and Lord Shiva give so much opulence to other people. People pray to Lord Shiva for material opulence, and he gives it very easily. It's described as Ashutosha. He's easily pleased, and he gives material opulence very easily. But it is very interesting that although he gives so much material opulence and so easily to so many people, he himself just lives under a tree. Again, showing that he has something so much higher than that. So we have a similar example in you could say recent history. It was a pastime concerning, I think it was Sanatana Goswami, but I may be mistaken. One of the Goswamis was said to have a touchstone. And someone heard about this, and he came to this Goswami asking for the touchstone. And perhaps he wanted to borrow it, or perhaps he wanted it. And the Goswami said, "Oh yes, it's just there in my rubbish pile." And so he went and he got it and found it, and he was really happy. But as he was walking away, he thought to himself, because he had some intelligence, so he thought to himself that if this is such a valuable stone, why was he keeping it in his rubbish heap? Perhaps he has something higher than this, otherwise he wouldn't keep such a valuable thing in his rubbish heap. And so he went back to the Goswami and he asked him, and the Goswami said, does anybody know, was it Sanatana Goswami? Sanatana, yeah. Thank you, Prabhu. Says he went back to him and asked Sanatana Goswami that, how is it that you keep this in your rubbish heap? Do you have something better than this? And so he said yes, and he initiated him into the chanting of the holy name of the Lord. And then that person experienced actually the real treasure, the real happiness. So in this way, Lord Shiva has no interest in the other material opulences, because he has the real opulence of love of God. Okay, so there's another point Sati made to her father Daksha. So now we come to the point of Sati trying to explain to Daksha, but he's not listening. Okay, so he's not listening, she's not able to convince him. Remember, we said her original purpose in coming to Daksha's house was to convince him to give up his envy of Lord Shiva. And in different ways she's tried to explain to him Lord Shiva's position so that he will give up his envy. But Daksha he's too hard-hearted and too materialistic to hear what she's saying. And he's not even acknowledging her, what to speak of this, taking her advice. So Sati, now realizing where Daksha is at, and that she's not able to convince him, she decides to give up her body. So that is also, she's acting according to the Shastra, because there's also a deeper purpose to that. It's not just that she's upset because her father has neglected her husband. There's also deeper reasons to that. That she wants to mitigate the offense of having heard a great devotee being blasphemed. Now we have to be careful of this. We can't imitate. In this age and in our position, the best thing is just to walk away try to defend, or if one's not able to defend the great soul, then walk away. In that way, showing one's, showing one's, that one does not accept such statements and showing one does not approve of such statements. So, sati, however, it is said that the Brahmana should not give up his body because his body belongs to the Supreme Lord. And the Kshatriya, however, should, and the Kshatriya, however, because it's a Kshatriya, he should actually kill the person. Of course, again, it's a different age, different circumstance, where people understand and should not have done these things. But the Vaishya or Shudra should give up his life. So she is being humble and considering herself among the Vaishyas or Shudras, because as Krishna explains in the Bhagavad Gita, Stri Vaishya Tata Shudra, so that they're considered on the same level. Of course, us men are considered Shudras today, generally speaking, because Kalo Shudra, Sambhavaha, that everyone is born as a Shudra. So when in the Shastra, when a woman is described as being lower than the man, especially in terms of intelligence, it's referring to like a real man, which is hard to find today. So women become so upset these days when they hear these things, because they know where men are really at. So addicted to sense gratification and under the control of their senses. So, but when we refer to like a real man, as was existed in the Vedic times, then it becomes more clear, these things. And of course, in any event, it's like saying that, oh, someone has someone has a Kmart jumper and someone has a Gucci jumper. So it doesn't make the one person superior to the other just because the one has a Kmart jumper and the one has a Gucci jumper. I mean, someone would have to really be very kind of foolish to think in that way. But generally we understand it's just a jumper, it has nothing to do with my real self. So when we hear statements about a woman being inferior to a man, as a woman we shouldn't feel offended, and as a man we shouldn't feel proud, because in any event the body has zero connection with our real self. It's just a temporary material covering made of bowel, mucus and air, according to the Srimad Bhagavatam. So there's nothing to be too concerned about, but the point is to understand what the weaknesses and strengths of the body are, and to be able to use it accordingly for its real purpose, which is self-realization. So, coming back to the point of Sati, she decided in her humility that the best thing for her to do, in order to mitigate the offense of having heard a great devotee blasphemed, would be to give up her body. She also felt very contaminated by that connection with her father, because her father, now being so offensive towards a very great devotee of the Lord, she felt actually contaminated by that bodily connection. And she herself describes to her father that every time Lord Shiva calls me Dakshayani, that was a common way that a husband would refer to his wife as being the daughter of her father. So every time she says, every time I hear Lord Shiva refer to me that way, I become very morose, because my whole mood is spoiled, because I remember actually how contaminated I am, having a bodily connection with someone who is so offensive to a great Vaishnava. because this is not just one thing that happened very quickly, had happened and been going on for a very long time, this offensiveness towards Daksha, towards Lord Shiva that Daksha had maintained. And so for all that time she was carrying that weight of this contamination. And so therefore she decided to finally just, of course she came first to try to convince Daksha, but then after, when she saw there was no possibility of convincing him, then she finally gave up her body. Okay, so that is the context in which this verse appears, that finally Sati gives up her body, and now the demigods are, the other demigods, having witnessed what has happened and understood what has happened, they were very, very astonished that how could Daksha, who is meant to be a Prajapati, a progenitor and one who maintainer of living entities in this universe, how could he neglect, if he's maintaining everyone, so many people at least in the universe and so many living entities, how could he neglect even his own daughter? To the extent that when she gives up her body, he doesn't even do anything. He didn't even do anything when this happened. So hard-hearted he had become. And it's due to excessive material attachment that he had become this way. This is what happens when one becomes too materially attached, is that one eventually becomes hard-hearted. Material attachment means attachment to controlling and enjoying this material world. It means being rebellious towards Krishna. Material attachment is not like an innocent thing. It is directly, we're trying to be the enjoyer and controller. We're trying to imitate Krishna. And in that way we become hard-hearted. And just the opposite of that is love of Krishna, in which we become soft-hearted, realizing that we're fully dependent on Krishna and we are meant for Krishna's pleasure. So, so we just make one more point that it's mentioned here that Daksha is the maintainer of all living entities. So of all living entities, because he's like there's many Prajapatis, many progenitors, but he's like the chief of them. So he has a very high position. And that's just a point that, according to the Srimad Bhagavatam and Bhagavad Gita, the living entities in this universe come about not according to the modern theory of things that Darwin gave and others are given, that things have just evolved out of chemicals over time and without any intelligence behind them. But everything's happening by the arrangement of persons with intelligence, and particularly there are persons who have superior intelligence to ours who are arranging all these things. And it's ultimately coming from the Supreme Person, Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is unlimited intelligence, and under which this whole material universe is being created, maintained, and destroyed. So repeatedly. So it's all happening by the control of persons. It's just like this chair that I'm sitting on. It's such a simple thing. It's so simple. But no one you'd have to be really foolish to say that this chair could have just come about without a person having made it. So what to speak of the complex universe? Just to create this chair, someone had to design it, someone had to manufacture the materials, someone had to then put it together. So actually so many people went into making such a simple thing as this chair, and they had to use their intelligence to do it. So what to speak of such a complex universe that we're in? How could we suggest that there's no persons behind it? There's always persons behind everything. So Daksha is one of those persons, and he's the living entities in the universe. He's one of the quite high up demigods called the Prajapatis. They live on Janaloka, and which is a higher planetary system, even higher than the general heavenly planets, and they generate living entities for the whole universe. So Krishna explains in Bhagavad Gita as well that the original sages come from him, and from him all the other, first of the patriarchs, from him all the other entities in the universe have come about. And Krishna is the original progenitor, you could say, of the living entities in this universe. So that's how all the living beings come about, not just by some evolution or chance. Okay, so we'll end on that point, and we've got 15 minutes left. Hare Krishna. Okay, are there any questions or comments? Anything anybody would like to share? Add to what was said. Yes, Chanidas Brewer.
The question is that as you were talking at the end about how the various presenters, Daksha and so on, and generate all of them being all of the variety of them in speech, reminded of the so-called king breeding slows, when at a certain point in history, all of a sudden, there's thousands of new species that show up in every large record, and scientists have no idea why suddenly there's one variety of species that they find embedded in rocks, and then just a couple of years later, there's a huge variety that seemingly come out of nowhere. Are we to understand that someone like Daksha and his various wives comes down and generates all these living entities at particular times?
That's an interesting question. You mean in that particular case or in general?
Well, in those kind of cases,
we get it. I can't comment on that particular case because I don't know. But in general, as we read Srimad Bhagavatam, we get sort of some understanding of how things are coming about, and what we do start to see is that it's not simple. Yeah, that's what I've noticed, how this, just in my tiny observation, I'm not even like a scientist myself, but I've just kind of noticed that the explanation tends to be a little bit on the simple side, if you know what I mean, like just kind of like that, from small to gradually big, and just it's actually quite complex, and it's often very personal how things are happening. And that's not surprising, because what I am a student of, I'm not a student of science, but I'm a student of history. At least I did study history for my occupation, and that's one thing I noticed that's really struck me out of my studying history, was that how complex things actually are. So complex. And I'll give you an example. I had one assignment to do on those who are familiar with the history of the Prague Spring. If you don't know about it, then you really don't need to worry about it. It's a very mundane event, but it was like a revolution that took place in the Czech Republic, maybe I think 60s or 70s. And so they asked a question on it, and you had to read it. And of course, to answer the question, you had to write an essay on it. And to write the essay, you have to do research. So they gave 3 or 4 sources, and we had to make reference to all 4 of them in our answer. In that way, demonstrating that we actually read all 4 sources. And they were quite long, the sources. They were, good, like many pages long each one. So I read the first one, the first source, and I thought, I got this down now. I totally understand now how this thing happened, and I can answer this question, and I'm going to do it, and I'm ready to write this essay and get it done. And then I thought, but hang on, they won't give me the marks if I don't reference the other sources. So I thought, okay, I'll just read another one, or just go through the others quickly so I can just put a reference in there, and that way I get my marks. But as I started reading the second source, it became really clear that I did not actually know what happened in this revolution. It was just a lot more complex than what I thought. And there was, what that source said was so, you could see some connections, but it was so different from what the other source said. So eventually I read all four sources, and I realized that this is very complex happening, an event. And it was not a simple thing at all. And it was very hard to understand actually what happened and how it happened. So that's just a tiny little event 30 years ago in history that took place over a question of we can know how long it was, but definitely not longer than a few months, maybe even 2 or 3 months. What to speak of things that are happening over millions of years? Because the Srimad Bhagavatam gives us history going back, well, we can't even, it's just trillions of years, it's going on in cycles, and it often refers to previous kalpas, which is like trillions and millions and billions of years ago. So it's very complex how things happen, but one thing we can see, one thing we can say for sure, is that it's very personal. As was my experience in studying history also, is that everything was very personal. It was all about persons and their desires, and one person desired things in this way, and so many crazy things happened because of their particular way of wanting to do things, and their desires and their desires and repulsions, like desires and hatreds of different peoples, what created so many things. So similarly, it's not surprising that in histories going back millions of years and on other planets and so on, and on this planet, as has always been the case, it's always been very personal and very complicated. Yeah. So how the living beings come about on these different planets is from persons doing certain things and going certain places and doing certain things and this and that, and it's always very complex. And there may be times in the history of this planet where there's not many living entities around. It is possible we can understand that from various things we've read in the Srimad Bhagavatam. There was I think it was the Haryashvas or someone. There was one group of persons who went into meditation, and they came out and the trees had just taken over the whole planet basically. There were just trees everywhere. So, and then there's always these devastations that take place, partial devastations where the earth's covered in water, so there can't be many human beings around when that's going on. Prabhupada often actually makes reference to that a few times, how first there's living entities just in water and then gradually they come onto the land and so on. Because at some points in history there is just water on this planet. And obviously not much else can survive except the aquatics under such conditions. So yeah, that's all I can really say, that it's very complex. It's very often inconsistent and very complex, inconsistent, and it's very personal. Yeah, that's all I can really say authoritatively. I don't know if I had to say more than that, I'd just be speculating. From what I read in Srimad Bhagavatam, but there are so many Puranas and so on which often do explain things like that. It would be an interesting research project to do, to go into these different Puranas and read these things. Srimad Bhagavatam is concerned with pure love of God, and it gives us, everything is focused on that, and it makes reference to everything just with relation to that. So often things are described in brief. Is that okay? Any other questions? Yes, Matthew?
Hi, Krishna. Thank you. How do we reconcile our material desires with Christian consciousness? So I have the desire to have my own home for security for my children, but sometimes when I'm focusing on that, I do become half-hearted and materialistic. So
Yeah.
how can I surrender that to Krishna and offer out and trust that it will come in time?
Just say that last sentence again. How can I?
How can I just surrender that along and trust that it will come in time?
Okay. Yeah, okay. Alright, so thank you. So it's so you're saying you have material desires for like a home and security for your children and so on, but you want to surrender to Krishna, so how can you dovetail it and know that you're going to get there in the end and not just get overwhelmed by the material things? Is that sort of?
Yeah, and because sometimes I get a lot of passion and ignorance when I'm just focusing on the home or what it's going to be like, what's going to happen and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it takes me away from Christian consciousness as well.
Right, yeah. Well, that's why it's good to always remember that Krishna consciousness is a process. It's not it's not just a belief system. So we have to. It's a very nice thing a devotee can do. It's like a sport almost. Is to arrange one's. It's a constant thing. You know, as a grihasta myself, I can definitely see how it's you think you got it right, and then you got it for some time, the sort of balance, if you like, or the good structure, and then things come up and you have to readjust. And so it's a constant endeavor, but it's a nice sport to be able to constantly try to adjust our lifestyle in a way that we have, number one, good sadhana, as best as we can with sadhana, and number two, devotional service. So, because as we're a conditioned soul, and the way we connect to Krishna is through devotional service, through actively engage in devotional service. This won't happen any other way. Yeah, so it's a process, and we have to try to constantly adjust to constantly see how much of the process we have in our life. How much time do we have for chanting Hare Krishna in an attentive space as possible? How much service do we have? It's good to try to get ourselves on a roster, to get rostered for something, for a service, because that then it won't just happen when we think we have the time, when it creates that sort of commitment and forces us to adjust our lifestyle according to that service. And that is where the dynamics can begin to happen, when we have that commitment. So it's sort of like that, just making arrangements for our sadhana and making sure we have as much devotional service as possible. Sadhana means chanting Hare Krishna, especially, and reading Srila Prabhupada's books, and then as much practical service as we can. And just keep adjusting, keep making that effort. And Krishna appreciates that effort, because he understands how difficult it is in this modern age especially. But we keep trying, and Krishna appreciates that, and he helps us. And another thing I'll just state lastly is that, because there may be times when you're just really struggling, to get those things in place. But if we keep the strong desire in our heart, for that I really want to have really good sadhana, I really want to do a lot more service. We keep the desire there, then Krishna will fulfill it. He definitely will fulfill it, because Krishna is fulfilling everyone's material desires. Why would he not fulfill the spiritual desires of a living instant who wants to serve him? Definitely he will fulfill it. It just may take some time. So we have to keep that desire always, and then just try our best to arrange things in a way they feel. And yeah, again, just remembering that it's a process, not just a belief system. Yeah, we're gonna get from being conditioned soul to being Krishna conscious through following the process Krishna gave, not any other way. Yeah, is that okay? Hare Krishna. Any other questions or comments? Just on time, Granjai Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai, Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai, Gaura Premanandi,
Please.